And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. China commemorates the 80th anniversary of the Nanjing Massacre, has designating today as a National Memorial Day, promoted the awareness of China's suffering in World War II. And what about the future? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Now let's turn to Nanjing, where thousands gathered for a remembering service to pay respects to victims who died during the Nanjing Massacre. Today is the 4th National Memorial Day. 80 years ago, on December the 13th, 1937, Japanese troops invaded Nanking and launched 6 weeks of indiscriminate killing and extreme torture. Before we go to our panel, let's take a look at this background story.
One minute of silence is the day to commemorate. Chinese President Xi Jinping and other leaders, along with thousands of people, including survivors of the massacre, soldiers, veterans, foreign friends, and school children, attended the National Memorial Day ceremony. December 13th was designated as a National Memorial Day for the victims of the Nanjing Massacre in 2014, and this year marks the 80th anniversary of the massacre. Yu Zhengsheng, chairman of the National Committee of the CPPCC, delivered a keynote speech.
Today
we gather here to hold a national memorial service for Nanjing Massacre victims in commemoration of the deceased and massacre and all lives that were lost during the Japanese aggression. It's a declaration that the Chinese will never forget the past and that will cherish peace in the future.
Japanese troops captured Nanjing, then China's capital, on December 13, 1937, and went on a killing spree that lasted over a month. More than 300,000 unarmed Chinese soldiers and civilians were murdered, and over 20,000 women were raped. That dark chapter in history has left generations of Chinese physically and emotionally scarred.
Their guns were this long, with a knife attached to it. That's what they killed my father with. And then they killed my uncle and my grandfather as well. My baby brother they stomped to death with their big leather boots. He was only 2 years old.
The Japanese invaders killed my father with 3 shots in front of where we were staying. My mother ran out to see him, but she was also shot dead and fell into my father's arms. When I came out, I saw my parents laying in blood.
"80 years have passed, but the history remains rooted in Chinese people's minds. For the survivors, their loved ones will never come back. Their memory of that winter will never fade."
For more on National Memorial Day for Nanjing Massacre victims, we are joined in our Beijing studio once again, Xiyu, Senior Fellow, China Institute of International Relations. In Washington, D.C., we have Mr. Yoshikazu Kato, who is a research fellow at the Charhar Institute and also columnist at the New York Times Chinese Web Edition. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Peter Kuznick, who is a professor of history and also director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University. Welcome as well. First of all, I want to make very clear why we are having this discussion, gentlemen. It is not about the growing of hatred. It's about remembrance and reconciliation. It's about understanding what really happened in history so that the same kinds of crimes would not repeated in the future. Meanwhile, it's about our attitude toward the peace. So with that note, I want to start off our conversation. Mr. Kato from Japan, I understand you've been living in China for quite a number of years. I'm sure you have been talking about this specific period of history with many of your Chinese friends. So what do you make of the current gap of understanding among some in Japan and what the world has got to know as the Nanjing Massacre? Briefly from you, sir, Mr. Kato.
First of all, I think this is a really important time to talk about history and how to face to the future. I think it's a really important time. And I think a lot of Japanese, even most of Japanese, they love peace. And actually they know how the Chinese people are feeling about, Chinese people are thinking about. But as you mentioned, there still exists some gap. Perhaps because of some in Japan, China relation is getting more complicated, or sometimes politicians, playing somehow more politicized way. That's why history, how to face the history, how to perceive the history at this moment. I think at this time, some gap will be existing. So I think now, for Japanese people, it's a good time to know or understand more about how Chinese people feel about, Chinese people thinking about. So I'm glad to see a lot of Japanese media is reporting this ceremony. So I think it's a time to know and understand more on this history. I think it's a really important time.
Also briefly from you, Professor Kuznick, you are a professor of history. Of course, the Nanjing Massacre, 300,000 people killed, that specific tragic incident is not as well known as the Auschwitz tragedies. This has a lot to do with how history has came along, in fact, over the past few decades. But having said that, though, how will that awareness be raised, rather, in the future?
It's important the way countries deal with their own history. No country wants to deal with the negative side of its own history. No country wants to deal with the atrocities that its people have committed. The one example that we have of a country that's dealt honestly with its past is Germany. German students are raised with lessons of the Holocaust. Holocaust denial is illegal in Germany. But in Japan, we have many people who deny the fact that the Nanjing Massacre even occurred. We have Japanese textbooks that whitewash this history. You mentioned the figure of 300,000. That figure is not accepted in Japan. Some Japanese say 20,000. At most, they say 200,000, and some say none at all. So the way countries deal with their past is very, very different. And it behooves us all in every country to deal honestly, confront the past, because we all have things that we're ashamed of, the United States as well as every other country. But Japan has done a very poor job, and the problem is that Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, has been in the forefront of those who want to whitewash and deny Japanese history at the same time that he's pushing for the remilitarization of Japan, and that makes a corrosive and dangerous combination that the Chinese people are correctly responding to.
Mr. Yang, you listened to your two colleagues coming from Japan and the United States, but that is the realities actually we are talking about here, about this part of the region, Mr. Yang. The question is, sir, how will China react to all of this? You know, the far right in Japan, the administration that is favoring about whitewashing history, and yet that country, Japan, is an important player in the region, in the Asia-Pacific region, and China needs to have a good relationship with its neighbors for a peaceful future for all. So how is China going to handle that dilemma? It's a very tricky issue. History is always very emotional, as you know.
Yes, actually we are indeed in a dilemma for a long time. On one hand, we are very even upset of Japanese resistance to recognize the truth of the history. But on the other hand, we really desperately need the shared future. You mentioned the peaceful future. We need a shared future. We have the shared future. But the shared future should be based on the shared acknowledgement of our shared history. Frankly speaking, that dark page of the history shared by China and Japan. We need to have the common sense and the common acknowledge and the common value about that dark page of the history. Unfortunately, we haven't reached, and we need to make a constant efforts to reach that goal, not for, as you earlier mentioned, not for growing hatred, but for our shared value and the shared future.
Having said that, though, we see growing tensions in the region. Earlier, we had a big debate about the Korean Peninsula issue, how things are boiling at this point. But at the same time, you see countries are trying to readjust their national foreign policy vis-a-vis how the other players in the region and even beyond are going to act on their own. Meanwhile, you see the United States, in a way, trying to be different from its previous role, both in the region and in the rest of the world. So this creates a lot of space, vacuum, but certainly a lot of uncertainty and opportunity, all at the same time. So in this regard, Mr. Kato, under this light, what is history to us now?
First of all, as I mentioned, we need to know and understand well what happened during that wartime. And Japanese people, Japanese government to the people, we need to be sincere and humble attitude to what happened. And now, what we are talking about is not only the history, but the perception to the history. So as Mr. Yang mentioned, we need to communicate and share and our perception to the history. At this moment, in this dimension, I think, as you mentioned, there is some gap, how to perceive the history. So I think in terms of this, I think now we need to have more communication, and we need to know, as a Japanese, we need to know how the China on the national level, what they are emphasizing and what they feel about that. So this is the process of reconciliation. So it's a very important time in terms of facing to the future, and Japan-China relationship is very important, and we need to take a responsibility for regional stability and peace. So this is my what I'm thinking about.
I see. Professor Kuznick, what I'm talking about earlier is different layers of uncertainty. The uncertainty about different understandings of the history and acceptance of what really happened. Another layer of uncertainty in the region with some of the hotspot issues. Another layer is all the players in the region and in the rest of the world are now changing their roles in the world and try to adjust themselves as a result of how others would act and react. So these different layers of uncertainty piled up makes history ever more tricky an issue. What could be the remedy?
Well, the first thing we need to do is begin to see the world through the eyes of our adversaries. People have very different perceptions. It gets down to the individual level, and it gets down to the national level. In terms of the conflict between the United States and Korea, North Korea, the American people have no understanding at all of how the North Koreans view history. To the North Koreans, the Korean War is still part of their daily life. They know that the United States leveled every city in North Korea and South Korea, almost destroyed the country, as a part of their consciousness. In terms of World War II, the Japanese, the number of deaths among Chinese in World War II, most Western experts put the figure at between 10 and 13 million. But the Chinese officially say 35 million. And so the Japanese have not really dealt with that in terms of Japanese aggression, not only against China, but against the rest of the countries in the region. And so there's a high level of mistrust.
Yes, indeed, a high level of mistrust. We are saying the three layers already, about history, about hotspot issues, and now about the world's changes. So three layers of uncertainties. Professor of history, how do you read these different layers of uncertainty? Do you think there's some wisdom that would help us to get through this? Very briefly from you, sir.
There's a new level of uncertainty, and that's been interjected by the Trump administration. Donald Trump is an ignoramus when it comes to history. He knows no history, and he acts impulsively and recklessly without understanding the consequences. So he's complicated all of this situation. We've got a very dangerous situation now in Asia, on top of which we've got the conflicts between China and Japan over the Senkaku and the Xiyu Islands, and more broadly. And so we need to begin to sit back and discuss these things and begin to understand how each side sees them, rather than from one's own nationalist perspective.
All right. Professor Yang, we only got 30 seconds left for you, but what do you think could be the remedy and the way forward? Mr. Yang.
Well, all the uncertainties on the 3 layers you mentioned indicated that the regional order and the global order is in course of the reshaping. And all the players in the country should make a joint efforts for the same direction rather than the confrontational different directions.
Even though our time is very limited for this time, I'm sure the discussion of history and certainly our shared future will be very much the future topics for our show. But for now, thank you so much, the three of you, Yang Xiyu, Yoshikazu Kato, and Peter Kuznick. With that, we're coming to the end of today's program. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.